think we're going to start. Thank you. Thank you for coming to this One Bay, One Book, which is a program, it's a whole series around within the Jewish community around the Bay Area, where every year one book is selected. I think this might just be the second year. And this year's selection is Dara Horn's Guide for the Perplexed. And I'm really thrilled that Rabbi Creditor is going to be speaking on this. There are lots of other events around this book going on. I don't know the exact schedule, but I know, and I don't even know the website, but I'm sure if you Google One Bay, One Book, you will get it, and there will be other events. And I'd just like to say that this is being put on by the Adult Education Committee, and if ever you feel so moved to donate to the committee, this is what makes events like this possible throughout the year. So, Rabbi Creditor, thank you. Please.
So, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, for those of us who are in the room and those of us who might be watching anywhere else via YouTube, welcome to Netivot Shalom. It is really great to be able to learn together today and to celebrate the culminating work both of Dara Horn's writing, Jewish Learning Works, which is a San Francisco-based educational organization and a synagogue that cares about being interconnected with the larger Jewish world. It's just good to be able to do this kind of learning together. Let's start with a bracha, a blessing for learning, and then we'll jump right in. Okay, so if you don't know it, sing anyway. So I thought we could structure our conversation about Dara Horn's book, The Guide to the Perplexed, A Guide to the Perplexed, by talking about themes, perhaps connecting some of the central characters, talking about how that interrelates with one of those themes in particular, and then seeing where our conversation goes. I hope that you've had the chance to read this book. If you've not yet read A Guide to the Perplexed, I recommend it very highly. If you haven't read Dara Horn's other books, I recommend them very, very highly. Not only is The World to Come, her second novel, my favorite of the novels she's written, it's also my favorite book I've ever read. And so this one's good, but just so you know, that one really does rank up there with Ender's Game and Stranger in a Strange Land. And that just tells you the kind of genre that tickles my fancy. But they all are actually interrelated in ways that we could explore another time. Some of the themes that I thought we could point to are providence, what God knows in advance, how God might be involved in the course of history, memory, which plays the central role. If there's a character in the book which predominates, the character is memory, almost disembodied, as we'll look at in a moment. Certainly family dynamics, that is all through this book. Who has power and what does it mean to use it? Both when it comes to questions of memory and family, but also in general. And then another central question is tshuva. what repentance actually means. All of this plays into the lives of all of the characters that Horn weaves. I had the delight of having coffee with Dara when she was in town about a month and a half ago. We sat near Buena Gardens, just had a cup of coffee, and the truth is, we're both astounded by the potential of what she's pointing to. She writes with incredible clarity, with incredible imagination, and with the depth of knowledge that I just don't know anyone else has. But she's also very grounded and very human, and she's very aware of who she is, how young she is, and yet what we're supposed to bring. And so to anyone who's listening here or anywhere else, if you wonder whether or not you have something to bring because history is so weighty, Dara's telling you can. And we could listen if we were open to it, and I hope we are. So let's talk about the characters. One of the ways in which she creates this ingenious narrative is by weaving, as she does in all of her creations, stories and vignettes that don't seem like they intersect, but once she tells you how they do, you know they do. So for instance, we have all of these sets of siblings. We have Joseph and his brothers from the stories of Genesis, and his brothers are typified here by Judah. So Joseph and Judah. Then we have Rambam, Maimonides, and his brother David. Then we have Solomon Schechter and his twin brother Strulik. Then we have Josie and her sister Judith. Now, if all you knew was that, you would say, oh, interesting, how is she going to do that? But then you listen to the names of the protagonists, Josie and Judith. Josie, whose full name is Josephine, Joseph. And then Judith, which is the female version of Judah. So we've got Joseph and Judah with a little bit of gender bending. Then you say, oh, that's fascinating. And if you follow the course of the story, Josie is kidnapped in Cairo, becoming renowned for a work creation, an app basically that she's created called Geniza. The Geniza is a place where you take sacred documents and you bury them because we treat them with incredible reverence. We do that as a community. You don't throw things away when they have God's name on them. And in fact, things that are significant, even if they don't have God's name, sometimes end up in a Geniza. The most famous Geniza of all was found in Cairo, not by Solomon Schechter. It was found much earlier than that. And then two twins bring news to him of this Geniza, and he knows he's got to go. We'll talk in a moment about who each of these characters are. But Solomon Schechter finds the Geniza in Cairo. Egypt is where Joseph was sold into slavery. Or we were sold into slavery. Joseph was sold into bondage. I don't know that there's a difference, but in the story, we could say that there's a difference between the two. And in Cairo, in the Geniza, they find a letter. They find many, many things, a trove of documents. They find a letter written by Maimonides to his brother David, and then a letter about David written by Maimonides when David dies at sea, about going down to his grave, mourning. A quote directly taken from Joseph and Judah's father, Jacob. Jacob refused to be consoled when he thought that Joseph was dead, saying, I will go down to my grave in mourning. The interrelationship of all of these stories, let alone asthma as a theme, which Dara Horn also brings out. We don't know that that's actually historically true. There's a note in the back of the book where she says, I don't know if asthma actually was the plague afflicting the vizier in Egypt, but that's what Maimonides supposedly became famous for suggesting the cure to, by which Maimonides was appointed as a doctor. Solomon Schechter had asthma, according to this story. Whether or not he did, he spent a lot of time in a dusty Geniza. And Josie and Judith, when they're girls, have a frightening encounter where the same kind of pit, we're supposed to hear it that way, the same kind of pit that Joseph was thrown into by his brothers, Judith is thrown into, and she can't get her asthma inhaler. Josie, sorry. So many J's. And so here are a few different ways that we can begin. I thought it would be a really interesting thing to do, since we said a bracha for learning, is to take different pieces of Torah that each one of those characters conveyed to us, and perhaps use them as a frame. So here is what Joseph says to his brothers. from a book, if you don't have this one, this is also a really good one, Tree of Souls by Howard Schwartz. It's an edited anthology of incredible midrash. At the end of Genesis, Joseph, surrounded by his brothers, takes a vow of the future generations. And if part of what links this book, one story to the next, is memory and legacy and what we actually remember, this is what Joseph says: I'm about to die. God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, you shall carry up my bones from here. Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So what's fascinating is, generations later, they did take the bones of Joseph. How did they remember where he was buried? It's 400 years. There's a legend that there was a woman who lived 400 years plus, perhaps forever. Her name is Serach bat Asher, and she alone has the ability to remember that far back with precision about what has happened. And so she directs everyone to the coffin of Joseph, which is submerged under the water, and by miracle, it's an incredible legend, Moses calls upon the bones, the coffin rises, and that's how they find. But so important to recognize that the key to that midrash is memory. You can't forget certain things. In the constructed Geniza that Josie makes, this computerized app that records every image and sound and gesture in your life by plugging into every device you have, whether you ask it to or not. It knows where you've been. If you lose something, it's been watching you. So if you are afraid of the NSA, you don't like this book. Or you do because it helps you get more afraid and helps you recognize that the technology is really at hand. But this Geniza doesn't forget anything. Imagine what life would be if you couldn't forget anything. There's a novel by a woman named Anne Ursu. She's not a well-known author, but she's an amazing author. This novel is called Spilling Clarence. And in the novel, there's a town called Clarence, which sounds like some American cities. There is a university, there's an assisted living facility, there's a chemical plant, there are bookstores. A chemical spill occurs, and the chemical that is released has only one property. It releases your memories. It makes it impossible to hold back your memories. If you think about a general landscape of multiple generations, what is the first population that's going to be affected by that kind of a spill? The elders, because they have the most memory. They've lived longest. And one of the characters you hear of is one of the liberators of Dachau. He was a ladies' man in the assisted living home. It's very charming. It's amazing. But he goes catatonic because he can't hold back what he's seen. Little by little, that spill continues until even the children start remembering too much, so much so that they start remembering other people's memories, thinking that it's their own. I have my own vignette from that, though not from a chemical spill, thank God, where my sister, who's younger than me, remembers changing my diaper. She really remembers it. I'm glad that I don't. But how weird it is that that natural story occurs. I remember things that I couldn't possibly remember because my parents or other people have told me them. What is memory in the end? So that is one of the themes that really pervades this story. What do you remember? How do you remember it? Maimonides has this wonderful quote: "A sensible person should not demand of me or hope that when we mention a subject, we shall make a complete exposition of it." I take great comfort in that. We bring something up, we are not going to conquer it in its totality. But there's another thing that typifies Maimonides that I'd like to share. When he was alive and he wrote, there are two classic things that people know of Maimonides, though he was so prolific you can't contain what he wrote really. He is known for the Mishnah Torah, which is a guide to Jewish law. It's called the Yad Chazakah. 14 is the clue for Yad. It's the numerical value, the strong hand, because there are 14 volumes in the collection. And Mishnah Torah was a controversial title to begin with, because it's also the way the book of Deuteronomy is referred to. So Maimonides was seen as a radical, self-important, brilliant person. And he created these things, including the Guide to the Perplexed, a Guide to the Perplexed, for which our book is named, which was burned. It was burned because he was a heretic. One of the things that made him so heretical is that he did not cite his sources. That is one of the reasons that later codes of Jewish law, such as the Shulchan Aruch, did not base themselves on Maimonides' work. They based themselves on other, like the Arba Turim. That's a different conversation, but a fascinating indication that Jewish literature does not take kindly to those who do not give attribution. In fact, we have, as part of our tradition, those who quote something in the name of the original sayer or writer bring redemption to the world. Mevi ge'ula le'olam. It's an amazing idea, which means we care about memory even when we're just quoting, even when we're teaching. So this is something that Maimonides says as a comment on Pirkei Avot, as part of the Mishnah around the year 200 CE. Rabbi Levitas of Yavna said, "Be exceedingly humble in spirit." Rabbi Yishmael, his son, said, "One who learns in order to teach is afforded the opportunity to learn and teach, whereas one who learns in order to practice is afforded the opportunity to learn, to teach, to observe, and to practice." Rabbi Tzadok said, "Do not fashion it into a crown with which to magnify yourself, nor into a spade with which to dig." But this is Maimonides' first comment, and there's more to it. But just to hear the beginning. After I decided that I would not discuss this counsel because it is clear, and also because of my awareness that my teachings concerning it would not appeal to most of the great sages of the Torah, and perhaps to all of them, I revoked my decision, and I shall discuss it without regard to either previous or current authorities. And what is also powerful to know is he really was that good, and people listened to him. But he knew he was that good, which made people not really want to listen to him. It's just unavoidable sometimes to see something so shiny, someone so precise, with such capacity, and ignore. So there are all of these things happening. And then we have Solomon Schechter. Schechter is a really important person to me, partially because he is the architect of American conservative Judaism. He has a much longer history than that. In fact, the shortest part of his life was doing that. But here is something that he had to say. When he was in Cairo, he reflected on the experience, and this letter was written while he was in Cairo, but it was read much later. Looking over this enormous mass of fragments about me, in the sifting and examination of which I am now occupied, I cannot overcome a sad feeling stealing over me, that I shall hardly be worthy to see all the results which the Geniza will add to our knowledge of Jews and Judaism. The work is not for one man and not for one generation. It will occupy many a specialist, a much longer than a lifetime. However, to use an old adage, it is not thy duty to complete the work, but neither art thou free to desist from it. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. Also from Pirkei Avot. It's not yours to finish the task, but you're not free from starting. So here we are reading the emotional sections of three different characters' lives. And the truth is, if you also want to know how Dara Horn is a character in her own book, it's not a far reach to read in her note at the end what she says to her children. Because if you remember, Geniza is a program that her character Josie creates that archives everything. Everything. So she speaks to her children. She says, "I would like to acknowledge the 4 people who tried their hardest to prevent me from writing this book. We have photographs and records of every occasion in their lives, but I hope they will grow to remember the many blessings in between." It's not that Dara is telling the story of her life. She's just speaking to all of us who have lives and relationships, that if we spend our time on devices like this, and I had this experience recently, videotaping someone I care about, but blocking my own eyes. What a mistake. What a mistake. A seductive, normal, technological mistake. If this is a real tool for connection, I'll put it down. And so the challenge that I'll offer all of us, and we were just studying recently the legal response from the conservative movement about taping and recording services on Saturday or on a holiday, which violate Jewish law but might be there for a purpose. You play to the camera, and in fact, this very experience, thanks to Itai, we're recording this talk. Am I speaking to a camera or to the people who are right here? Because I'd rather remember things that can't be remembered on film. So, here we go. A little bit about the Geniza. Okay, the Geniza itself, there's this iconic photo. If you look up Solomon Schechter, that's usually the photo you see. If you look at the Cairo Geniza, he is usually the photo you see, this man hunched over a table with a long beard with dusty stuff all around him. It was a treasure trove of about 300,000 documents telling the story from between 870 CE and the 19th century. It contains Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic. The bulk of the collection is in Cambridge, and the next largest, the much smaller collection, is at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, where Schechter himself was brought to be the president of the seminary. A fascinating anecdote, parenthetical comment, is that JTS was always the seat of conservative Judaism, sort of the middle road of American Judaism, and yet the people who brought him were Reform Jews. It was the Reform financiers of America who were afraid that without the counterbalance of conservative Judaism, a conserving impulse, trying to keep Americanism, which was very important, modernity, and Judaism alive, but a rich Judaism, they were afraid that Reform would always be reactionary, and conservative Judaism was necessary. It was failing then too. And so they spent a lot of money to bring the world's most renowned Jewish scholar to become the head of JTS. And he actually didn't believe in a stream of Judaism. He believed it was Judaism. He was the one who architected the incredible big tent that conservative Judaism tried to be for so long, and inevitably gave birth to great stuff. He was a direct teacher of Kaplan. His was a legacy that led to Louis Ginsburg, one of the great legal theorists of the Jewish world. He's the one who brought Shaul Lieberman, the greatest Talmudist of his age. And because of that legacy, people like Abraham Joshua Heschel and many others found their ways to the seminary. Orthodox, conservative, Reform, whatever. Schechter's legacy brought people in, and he did not want to be defined by any one title. He ended up using it, but it was a reluctant use. The Geniza was founded much earlier than Schechter's arrival on the scene, but what makes it really interesting is that he actually did hear about the Geniza from another set of siblings, from two spinsters who spent time in Cambridge. And widows, sorry, who, I'm trying to use some term, who took real delight in his attention as the fetishized Jew. He was their other. And they wanted to tell him, and they knew the reaction he would have, and he tried to contain himself, adhering to niceties. But what was said about Schechter by many contemporary scholars is he could be a real scholar if he could just sit still. He had a very hard time sitting still. You see by Dara's description of him, he needs to jump into the adventure of finding the Geniza and trying to sift through all of these things. He feels a frenetic energy, so afraid that he won't contain it all. Amazing. He wanted to be his own Geniza, in a sense. So, here are a few other things to know. If you don't know about Dara Horn herself, she was born in 1977. That tells you how young she is. She has managed to create an incredible, incredible textured part of Jewish literature where you really can't separate one story from the next. The greatest weave for me really is The World to Come, where she redescribes a world to come into very human and present terms, not leaving behind the fragility of human emotions, Yiddish as an incredible, incredible gift to the world, not just to the Jew, and how hard it is to find love, how hard it is to let birth and life unfold. In fact, it's in conversation, I think, with this book, because this book wants to say that all of life can be predicted. You know it's coming because the pattern that's observable. Everything is foreknowledge is given. We know what's going to happen. So, one last word before looking directly into the book. I realized, and she made this very clear afterwards too, that there's another parallel between the Torah story of Joseph and Judah and the book. And you have to be able to do the gender bending thing really quickly to understand what's happened. Not only is there a parallel between Josie and Judith and Joseph and Judah, if you read the Joseph stories, the novella at the end of the book of Genesis, there's an interruption, it seems, in the Joseph story, where Judah and Tamar. Judah has a son who dies, married to this woman Tamar, and Tamar is waiting to marry another son of his, which is according to tradition what Tamar needs and will do. So she plays, I would say plays a trick, but she seduces Judah by acting like a harlot by the side of the road. And they are together. And then when it becomes clear that she's pregnant, she reveals who the father is, but only to him. Judah, Tamar. When Josie is kidnapped and she's in Cairo, her sister Judith manages to replace Josie with Josie's husband, whose name is Itamar. Tamar and Judith. Tamar and Judah. Itamar and Judith. Story after story after story. One thing that I will say, and I'm hoping that we'll warn people that spoilers are coming, and if not, there are spoilers coming, is that the reveal at the very end of the book, we know the Joseph story. If you're unfamiliar, go back and read it. It's among the most powerful of the dramas in the Torah, and it's especially important because it's so human. God is not an active player in the story, at least on the surface level, and so if you chafe at God intervening in history, just read the story. Right? Because you don't have to see God as involved at all, and yet it's very, very holy. Very, very thorny. Joseph ascends to power in Egypt in the biblical narrative. His brothers come and don't know who he is, and he sets them up to repeat the very same sin that they did to him. They sold him, gave him up. In biblical terms, they sacrificed the beloved son. When he's in power and they don't recognize him, there's a new youngest child, Benjamin. He sets them up to give that child away, just like they gave him away. And as Maimonides teaches, real tshuva, real repentance happens when you're in the same situation and do not act the same. So they're in the same situation. They do not act the same. And then Joseph reveals himself, bursting out with tears. In the book, it doesn't quite happen that way. It seems like it's going to happen that way, but then Dara really tears the ground out from under you, because Josie is brought out disguised. So Judith finds her, but doesn't know that it's her she's speaking to. Pours out all of the things, all of the guilt, repents clearly right there, or maybe not so clearly. But that's the way the story will be told to Josie's family. Because the only witness that is going to talk about it is Josie. It turns out that Josie is chained and she can't speak. And so whereas her captor pretends to be translating, she can't say anything. The captor seems to be our voice, asking questions in a very strange way. And then when Josie is released and her sister is killed, Josie retells the story as if it were the Joseph story. Judith gave herself up for me. She's going to be a hero. She goes back home knowing what happened with Itamar and Judith. She knows what's happened with her own daughter. And yet, she tells the story in the most holy of ways. And holy can be seen as mythic, and mythic can be described as myth. And myth means not exactly history. She tells a story in a very distinct way. But now I ask you, don't we? Dara's asking us, don't we do the very same thing? And is there anything wrong with that? We tell a narrative as charitably as we can, sometimes. When we're our best selves, we only talk about the beauty. It's not ignoring the darkness. It's saying, no, I believe the best in you. That's how I encounter you, and that's how I talk about you. I referred to Orson Scott Card's book, Ender's Game, before, and the second book in that series is called Speaker for the Dead. One of the things that happens in that science fiction novel is a character who has committed inadvertently an atrocity invents a new way of recognizing those who have died upon their death. You tell the truth. The speaker for the dead doesn't hold anything back. It becomes a new religion because actually that's dignity. So we actually have competing notions of dignity. Do we need to be bearingly honest when we talk about the world? Warts and all. Do we talk only about the good stuff? What's your choice? And does one of those choices lead to a better future? So I'm just going to read a few vignettes from the book, and if you have it, I welcome you to read with me. I'm going to begin on page 316. In this, on page 316, Schechter is now speaking with his brother Srulik. Srulik actually was the founder of Zichron Yaakov in Israel. It's a very cool story. They have very different paths. Schechter becomes a pioneer in Jewish scholarship, and Srulik is a pioneer in founding the state of Israel. They both think they're following the legacy of their father. This is what Schechter says. There are entire worlds in those sacks of papers, even versions of the biblical books that no one has ever seen before, forgotten prophecies. It's going to take decades just to read them all. Have you any idea what we might find? No, I don't, Srulik replied cheerfully. And I also don't care. Forgotten prophecies don't interest me much. Who needs a prophecy if it's already true? Schechter looked again at his brother's youthful face. Was it possible that he had aged while his brother had gotten younger? Why live in a hole in a library, his brother elaborated. No matter how long you spend in that pit, you aren't going to resurrect the dead. Schechter said, but am I not obligated to try? What a challenge. And they're brothers. It's not like we're speaking to them, they're speaking to each other. Only in Dara's heart and imagination. We know that conversation. And we live in a world where, unfortunately, talk of resurrection should come to the mind even of a non-believer because there's too much death. Shouldn't we try? The task is so enormous. But so what? There's a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. I believe Srulik and Solomon, both Schechter, are trying to achieve a same beautiful world, trying to get there radically different ways. The question is, can they understand each other and work together? Can you imagine the world that would be? But that's not Dara's story. Flip with me, if you can, to page 195. Here's another vignette. On 195, Josie, who's been thrown into this pit, this dungeon, by her captors, is somehow, of course this is the story itself, blessed to receive a copy in French of the Guide to the Perplexed. I'm sure there's a significance to why it's in French. Maimonides was born in Cordovero, Spain, and then lived in Cairo. Maybe he spoke French too. Could not tell you, and I'll wait. Maybe Dara will watch this, maybe not, and maybe I'll just ask her. That night, Josie had an argument with the dead author of Guide for the Perplexed. Just let that sentence sink in for a second. I mean, again, I'm imagining, hopefully the setting is deeply unfamiliar, but the idea is not. Have you ever argued with a book? I do all the time. Her objection concerned the omniscience of God. She had followed him, meaning Maimonides, through his argument on the nature of evil, an argument which made more sense to her, even in the depths of her dungeon, than any other idea she had ever heard. This is Maimonides. Men frequently think that the evils in the world are more numerous than the good things, he had written. That a good thing is found only exceptionally, while evil things are numerous and lasting. Not only common people make this mistake, but even many who think they are wise. Maimonides is saying, you make a mistake when you think there's more bad than good. Maimonides, the scientist, is saying, you make a mistake when you think there is more bad than good. I'll just ask you, does he really think there's more good than bad? And maybe the answer is yes. But maybe that's also a decision that even an academic makes. These words gave her strength. Of course it gives her strength. She's in the darkness. And while we might not like to see ourselves as in darkness, in many moments in this world we are. We find ourselves where Shabbat begins earliest because the dark comes quicker. And that's why in Hanukkah there's a very popular song, Banu Choshech Legaresh, we came to dispel the darkness. And in the really, really trite Spider-Man musical that didn't make it anywhere, it's called Turn Off the Dark. Not turn on the light. We get it. This world has a whole lot of that. So what's our role? And can the history that we have lived help us face it and change it? Or is it a decision that every subsequent generation must make to see more good than bad, to decide to see more good than bad? To know that even though there are all these scraps of discarded stuff in our world, and we're never going to get to it, we're not even going to read all of it, let alone understand what it means, we're going to find redemption through it. We're going to start that task. Dara doesn't see herself only as an author. That was our conversation. I find her not only a theologian, I find her to be an incredible clarion call for action in this world based on a textured Jewish life. She is much more modest about who she is, but I kept on saying to her, that is who you are, and she didn't exactly say, no, I'm not, by the end. That might have just been how persistent I was. Flip with me a little bit more. Here's an amazing thing that happens as well. If you're looking for another parallel in the story between biblical narrative and the 17 different stories happening in the book. One of Josie's captors in Cairo has a son. Her program, Geniza, can create what feels like a living archive of a person because it knows everything about the person, and you can experience, in a certain sense, that person. That's what made me think of the Anne Ursu novel, Spilling Clarence, where the chemical releases all your memory. There is a man whose wife was killed in a car accident the year before the book begins, but because of the power of the chemical agent where you release all your memories, he locks himself in a room because suddenly he remembers his wife right there. This man, the captor, wants to be with his son desperately. And so that's why he keeps Josie alive, because she could create a Geniza copy of his son. What's his son's name? Musa. Musa is Moshe. Moshe in Egypt. Not only that, Maimonides is actually an acronym. Rambam acronym. Rav Moshe ben Maimon. Moshe, Moses, Musa. And when he is appointed as a royal physician, he is renamed. I have it written down, so I might mispronounce it. Musa ibn Maimon al-Yehudi. His name is Musa. So listen to what happens. Here's what we learn about Musa. Musa loved puzzles. He was fanatical about them. This is the boy. The other boys in the neighborhood were fanatical about soccer, but for Musa it was puzzles. When he was a toddler, he was captivated by the chalkboard kind that his mother bought cheap on the street. He mastered those quickly, putting together 48 pieces in minutes. As he grew older, he started creating puzzles of his own. He would break plates in order to reassemble them, fold and cut paper to build geodesic shapes in 3 dimensions. When the family worshipped in the mosque, he would train his eyes on the patterns of the medieval tiles on the walls. At 9 years old, he pointed out to his parents how the tile patterns were regular, all sequences of pentagons and decagons interspersed with rhombuses, with endless minor variations, but that they nonetheless never once repeated, despite being spread out over enormous surfaces, potentially infinite surfaces, in fact. The pattern would imitate itself, always following its own rules of symmetry in 10 directions, but it would never, ever, ever repeat. That's the whole book. That's life. I also love that we're in a room where the Aron HaKodesh, the Ark, which was designed by Blair Prentice and woven by Kathy Bolden, both members of our shul. The tent itself, the fabric, which was designed by Kathy and woven by her and by her daughter Naomi, is an unrepeating pattern. I still don't understand how that's possible. And I don't have an artistic sense of why it's important, but I have a meaning sense of why it's important thanks to Dara. This is Musa. That's who he was. Why did he, this captor, Musa's father, think that she would be able to create Musa again, resurrect his beloved son? Because she had done the same thing with her daughter, Tali, or so she thought. So if you'll turn back with me to page 155. Child, my Saba, Zichrono Livracha, Henry Creditor, had the camera, It wasn't a phone, it was a camera. It was bulky and heavy and it didn't work well. And yet we weren't allowed to blow up the candles until he was right there. How powerful is it that the moment that is lived has to be remembered, and remembered by a thing? Now, I don't in any way dispute how beautiful it was. In fact, I am now remembering him in an act of remembering. I do have a feeling, I might be wrong, might be my youth, I don't know, that my memory will last longer than that photo. I don't know that. And I don't know how things have changed today. Because we take so many pictures, no one really sees them anymore. They're all archived digitally. Do we hold them? Or do we flip them through and then we've got another device, we have to figure out how to flip them through. But you don't flip all the way back. So the photos that are a year old, maybe even 2 months old, when do you see them? On Facebook? Who goes back in time ever? So, on page 154, Josie and Itamar, right, that's her husband. Josie and Itamar had created an elaborate electronic archive of their daughter, the kind that many parents maintained for their children, now that Josie's software had made it nearly effortless. Memory is effortless, which means not engraved all that deep. It was a database of tens of thousands of photographs, video clips, medical records, report cards, art projects, all the detritus of a child's life preserved in digital form. But that was at home on another planet. Josie had nothing now except what she remembered, and she discovered that her own creation had hobbled her. It had been years since she had needed to remember anything. Her software had turned all memory into history. Stories replaced by collections of evidence, but after many nights of staring at a sarcophagus in her dungeon, of pounding the walls, of feeling herself slipping into oblivion, she sensed the ancient human power stirring within her. And during the days she began in the barest of notes to write things down, concealing each note behind a miniature electronic door. That's the way Geniza, the program, works. It's behind a door. So go to the next side of the page on 155, about 10 lines down, the last word is on. On a shelf in a virtual closet in one of those rooms, labeled, quote, games, the software had not yet learned her instincts. The program filed away the words. These are Josie's words, remembering Tali, her daughter. Tali playing checkers with Itamar, winning and gloated. Through an aircraft door, labeled, quote, travel, she wrote, Tali on a flight to Israel, shouting in Hebrew at the minyan near the bulkhead that they were blocking the emergency exit. That could have been me. As she wrote it down, she remembered the minyan, the quorum of 10 religious men praying together in the aisle of the plane, and Tali's fierce English whisper after Josie had tried to silence her Hebrew rant. Safety, Mommy! Tali had screeched in her bright orange t-shirt. They aren't being safe! Tali's fervor had surprised Josie, springing, as it seemed, from no experience of Tali's at all. She wondered whose arguments were braided into her daughter's genes. Then Josie closes these doors, these electronic metaphysical doors. The final line going to the next page. As she closed each door on the screen, Josie could not deny her growing impression that the Tali in this Geniza was very different from the Tali in the archive at home. The Tali in this Geniza, constructed of Josie's memories, was different than the archive at home. The Tali in the photographs and video clips that Josie and Itamar had preserved was adorable, bright, a delightful child who made adults smile, but this newly remembered Tali was fierce, demanding, anything but cute. To Josie's aching dismay, she couldn't tell which Josie was more real. Which Tali? I'm remembering without reading. Josie revised the software in her head again and again until it wasn't software at all, but a pathway to dreams. Josie, Joseph, dreams in a pit. Distant family. She opened its doors, wandered through them, descending spiral staircases, until she found herself in a subterranean garage, climbing into the driver's seat of her own car. She glanced up at the rearview mirror and saw her daughter in the back seat, black hair hanging in ragged, unbrushed ropes around her little face. How do we know that dinosaurs are real? Josie heard Tali ask. Maybe somebody just made fake bones and put them in the ground. Just hear Tali's question, because again, the whole book is right there. How do we know that dinosaurs are real? Maybe somebody just made fake bones and put them in the ground. How do I know that I, Tali, am real in your memory, Mommy? Maybe you're just telling me the story and it really never happened that way. Which one's reality? What you can record, or what you remember, or neither? Almost done. Go to page 68 with me. So those of us, since we're so close to Silicon Valley and anywhere else, the notion of clouds is ubiquitous. We have these things that we call clouds, though they're actually on the ground somewhere plugged in. But clouds are where you save things. Instead of a hard drive now, we put something on a cloud. But isn't it fascinating that in the biblical narrative, and clouds and heavens and dreams and sent from the external. So on page 68, at the very top of the page, Nasreen, who is an Egyptian woman who Josie doesn't yet know is part of this plot to kidnap her, Nasreen said, I have had this particular dream over 100 times. Fascinating. A person in power in Egypt has a dream and turns to Josephine. Well, you having this dream over 100 times, that will make the archiving very simple, Josie replied curtly. She was done with Nasreen. She focused her eyes pointedly on the screen, aggressively closing programs, returning to the library catalog. Now you can see how this same program works for the... Well, what do you think my dream means? Nasreen asked. Josie turned to her. Was this an attempt at friendship or a challenge? It was degrading not to know. Are you testing my talent for psychoanalysis? Because I really just do software, Josie said. I am testing your talent for prophecy, Nasreen replied. It's not me who interprets your dreams, says Joseph in the Torah. God gives me interpretations and I give it. I'm just the software. Later on the page, second to last paragraph, Nasreen wants to know if it's necessary. Why would it be necessary for Josie to know Nasreen in order to interpret the dreams? Why do you need to know me in order to tell me what this means? This was baffling. Was it not obvious? To know what these people and ideas mean to you, of course, Josie said. The challenge of not condescending was immense. Why would it matter what they mean to me? Nasreen asked. The message ought to be clear on its own. Josie considered this. In fact, the dream did have a rather obvious interpretation, but it didn't seem like the one Josie should share. That would depend on if you think dreams are internal or external, she said. I suppose the message ought to be clear to anyone if you believe that the dream's source is something outside of your own mind. But if the dream's source is in your own mind, then it should matter what these people meant to you. In the end, it's not that different, is it? Nasreen said. Her dark lips set in a smug grin. There is a message either way, just as I said. Later on, Josie keeps on disputing this. Nasreen again says they're the same if it comes from outside or inside. And it's easy to do this. I'm pointing to a cloud or to some primitive notion of God, and inside perhaps another primitive notion of God, but also a very personal point. In the end, Nasreen said evenly on the next page, they are the same. This was becoming maddening. They are not the same. They're opposites, says Josie. Nasreen smiled at her. Josephine, I think that for you it is daytime all the time, even at night. What do you mean? Nasreen kept smiling. For you, every confusing thing on earth is a problem that can be solved. Well, that's because every confusing thing on earth is a problem that can be solved. For the first time since Josie had met her, Nasreen laughed. The car you called should be waiting outside. I'll see you tomorrow. There's so much happening here. And when you know the way the biblical story goes, and you have a sense of the tension in Dara Horn's plot, your heart, my heart anyway, is pounding, because this is not going to go well. So I'm just going to end with one last scene, which for me ties it together. Before we look at the scene, there was a tshuva, a legal response that we, as a synagogue, learned yesterday. It's from a collection that is really worthy of being read, Responsa of the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, 80 to 90, edited by Rabbi David Fine, who's a very dear friend. The question comes up, as I mentioned before, about recording services. A traditional synagogue, a conservative shul, recording their services, videotaping or some other way on Shabbat or on holidays. And Elliot Dorff and Gordon Tucker write this. The rabbis must consider things seriously in deciding whether or not to allow taping on Shabbat or on holidays, which is a violation of Jewish law. In addition to the ones that someone else mentions, we note that tapes, or in our sense, digital recording, destroy the mythic quality that a ceremony would otherwise assume in people's memories. Tapes indiscriminately record the mistakes and limitations of events along with their positive features. Human memory, in contrast, blessedly enables us to filter out the miscues so that we can remember such events as being better than they actually were. Maybe families are better off not having a recording. And that works very well in concert with what is one of the most important for me sections of this book. On page 322, Schechter has now returned to Cambridge. He is sitting with Margaret and her sister Agnes, and they're having this very interesting conversation. All of the cryptic conversations that they've had have led to this one confrontation. We've seen Schechter with his brother. We've seen Maimonides with and about his brother. We've imagined Joseph and his brother. We've seen Josie and Judith, and Itamar, and Tali, and Nasreen, and Musa, and all of these characters throughout time just aching for life to last longer than it does, and for memory to be perfect enough that we can hold on to it. I mean, and then when we ask for what purpose, that's what they're all wondering. What comes of memory? And, you know, when you look back after reading a book, the first line of this book, what happens to days that disappear? I'm sure she wrote that sentence after. And if not, wow, is she even better than I already think she is. At the bottom of page 322, Schechter is struggling with the massive quantity of all of these scraps from the Geniza. So they say, Margaret asks, second to last paragraph, Mr. Schechter, do you honestly think that your parents would want you to know everything about them? Margaret asked. Or for that matter, her sister added, would you want your children to know everything about you? The room had dimmed by now. And I hear echoes of, Josie, for you, it's always daytime even when it's not. The room dimmed by now. The inked letters on the brown leather piles of parchments were no longer visible in the shadows. On the table before him lay stacks of dead animal hides, their words erased. Our mother died when we were 2 weeks old, Agnes said. Can you guess what our father told us about her? Schechter looked up weary. Nothing, Agnes said. Schechter stared. He thought of his own parents and siblings, of the endless conversations that had raged through their three-room house at every hour of the day, on every subject, about every person any of them had ever met. Nothing, he asked? It was unfathomable. The twins were looking at each other, shaking their heads. He never spoke of her to us, Margaret confirmed. Not one word. But weren't you curious? Of course we were, Agnes said. But after so many years of that kind of silence, one gives up asking questions. Instead, one searches for evidence. This reminds me of The Chosen and the Promise by Chaim Potok. We have a great deal of experience hunting for manuscripts, you see, Margaret added. We'd been through our father's papers hundreds of times. That was where we found our first palimpsests. The twins laughed. Schechter thought of the many palimpsests on the table before him, parchment where one text had been written over another. He had worked with them many times, enough to think of himself as one. It was a letter to our father from our mother, Agnes explained. Our father had written a draft of a legal brief over it, but underneath his handwriting, we could make out hers. Schechter breathed, relieved by their laughter. What did it say, he asked. There were only 2 phrases that were legible, Margaret answered. The clearer of the 2 was the signature, with affection, Margaret. I was named for her, of course. The other phrase was, they strive with me. Agnes continued, or possibly they strive within me. Any echoes there for you? That's what Rachel says when twins are struggling within her womb. Rivka. Ay, so many people, so much time, so hard to remember. Well, that struggle is a name that he earned later, but not the one that she asks about. Schechter processed the words, hearing echoes of other twins within them. Referring to the two of you before your birth, he asked. Of course, Margaret said. Of course, indeed, Agnes snorted. Frankly, Mr. Schechter, it could just as easily have been about the farmers down the road. But you see, that was irrelevant to us. From those 7 words, we summoned an entire person into being, like the Lord creating the world. It's quite possible that the mother we imagined was better than the mother who actually existed. Probable, even, Margaret added, because we never troubled to imagine any flaws. Agnes smiled. I don't think either of us would entertain the thought that what we discovered wasn't exactly what she wrote, she said. Even now that we are old women, we treasure that tiny discovery of a world that was, even if it was a world that wasn't. So the question that I'm left with this book, and let's talk a little bit about the questions that maybe you have or comments and observations that you might have, is not how amazing an author is Dara Horn. I have a feeling we agree. Not how lucky are we as a community to have Jewish Learning Works and other organizations that link us to really good stuff, good living Jewish stuff. Not only are there threads between our lives that actually connect us no matter how different any one of us might be. Those aren't questions. Those are at least intimations that are alive and vibrating in the room. The questions are, how much do we actually remember? How much do we want to actually remember? How do we tell our own stories? How do we tell the stories of our own pasts? Can we ever change the course of our personal destiny by willful acts? Is there hope for a world in which you might see more bad than good, and you might see more good than bad? What's your role in that, and does it make a difference what you do? Is it just going to happen anyway? One of the central themes in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed is that everything is known by God in advance, but we don't know what God knows, and therefore we have free will. That's kind of confusing. We're perplexed. But Maimonides wrote that it is noble to be perplexed. The very book, and this is the last thing that I'll say, the very book, Guide to the Perplexed by Maimonides, was written for his student. And his student's name was Joseph, the son of Judah. And it's a 3-part letter from Maimonides' heart to a beloved student about things that Maimonides likely struggled with himself, trying to point to a world that was more clear than the world he actually saw, which might mean that Maimonides, the scientist, was determined to see the world that he needed to see, and maybe even push it into being, even though it wasn't yet. What do you think? Yes, Ron? And I'll repeat the questions so that we can all hear.
So, I came a little late, which I apologize, but everything you say sounds like what I do as a psychologist. No, seriously, it's how do you reconstruct memory? People don't have tapes usually of, they may have pictures, but they don't have tapes of, dialogue and confusion and distortion. So they have to recreate it in an office. And there is a kind of a halo effect of things are better as things go along. But in that moment, am I going to become my parents?
Right.
Is this conundrum of my life, can I shatter it?
Right.
And, and there's a lot of grief in that unknowing, that perplexity. How do we hold that spiritually or, in an office? So it's a beautiful, I think, reflection of when people, come in the door, either here or in an office, and really try to struggle with how are we victims of our own fate or liberators of it.
Powerful. I'm never going to say that as well. But Rana was pointing to the resonance between what she does as a psychologist and the stuff that I'm drawing from the book, but that Dara brings to us. The conundrum of our own lives. Are we the author of our own destiny? Can we liberate, or are we trapped? Can we shatter the pattern that we've inherited? Is shattering the pattern even desirable? Couples choose to have, at the end of their wedding ceremony, we should break a glass. And in recent years, there's been the creation by artists of this glass in a velvet pouch that you break, representing the brokenness of the world, specifically remembering Jerusalem as pointing to a microcosm of the universe. The velvet bag is then sent to a company that reconstructs the crystals either into a goblet or into a mezuzah or some sort of other piece of art, but that the brokenness is reconstructed, and I hold that reminds me of the brokenness, but then maybe it's not broken anymore. And maybe I've forgotten that it's broken. It's very powerful. For me, I'm glad that I had a light bulb that no one put back together. But it's a very powerful question. Joseph Soloveitchik, known as the Rav in modern Orthodox settings, talked about the covenant of destiny and the covenant of fate. And he said it might be the same thing when you look at the arc of Jewish history and your own place with it. And he's talking about early Zionism, at least with the modern state. He says, if you believe yourself to be part of the covenant of fate, and this is in a book called Kol Dodi Dofek, The Voice of the Beloved is Knocking. It's a quote from Song of Songs that Soloveitchik aligned with modern Zionism, that God is knocking through history. Do you hear? Problematic, but also incredibly inspiring. He said the covenant of fate is where you're trapped into who you are. You're a Jew because Hitler told you you're a Jew. To be blunt, he didn't say it in such crass terms or blunt terms. But if you're in a covenant of destiny, you actively choose the history that's been handed to you, cultivating from it strength and the best that you could possibly imagine God wants of you. So as opposed to being defined by the outside world, feeling threatened and decided for, you have the choice to be the author in some measure of how you experience the unfolding of your life. An outside observer might not know the difference, but emotionally they're not the same.
Just playing on that, it seems that you didn't really talk about the idea of free will.
Yeah.
That runs through the book as well. And the relationship, it seems, between free will and not really the future, but the past, because we think about free will as, our control or lack of it, about what's going to happen. But then towards the end of the book, and I really puzzled over these lines, this is just after Josie's been freed and she's in the hospital bed. And it's on page 309, but it says, in a drumming rush of wind that burned through her lungs, Josie understood what Rambam had meant by absolute free will. I am completely free, she thought. Nazarene was right. It was impossible to control the future, but it was possible to control the past. And I guess hearing what you talked about, these choices about what we do with the past, it seems as though the message there is having free will is somehow about being able to select our stories from the past and deciding what's going to be maybe the best for the future, and that maybe even being able to forgive is dependent on not having the Geniza model of memory where everything is recorded, but that we need to, soften the edges and be more mythical and be selective. So I don't know what you make of this idea of free will and its relationship to the past.
I mean, you're pointing to an incredibly important, not only part of the book, not only part of Maimonides' thinking, but also part of living a modern religious life, living a meaningful life. Forget the word religious, but for me those two mean the same thing. In the end, I think that what you're reading from Dara's reading of Rambam is how I feel as well, which is that we actually have only so much control over the future. But the control we have over the future is directly related to how we let the past flow through us. That's free will. Free will is I determine how the past will course through me, the way I will tell a story, and I don't know that we really can do that. I think that we are so subject to the stories we've been told. But on the other hand, isn't that a gift as well? Because we have an imagination that processes it. We're sort of the emulsifier of everything that's happened. I am the product of so many things. Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers is a really good example of this. You might think of these tech giants of the internet and others as, or Wayne Gretzky in the NHL he uses as an example of self-made people. But if you do that, you ignore the context into which any one of us is born. He says you need 10,000 hours of practice of a certain thing, and then you are more versed. You're actually an expert in the thing, which means you have to have access to those 10,000 hours. And if you have a certain proclivity towards technology, if you were born near Silicon Valley and you had access to technology that no one else had, and the luxury of your parents or somebody else affording you 10,000 hours to practice, and you have a family lineage that teaches you a work ethic, and, then you come to a place where your impact might actually influence the future, but you can't erase your past in telling that story. And in fact, the impact that we have on our future, if we mistell the story that way, I did it myself, it takes the dignity and power away from everybody else. A young activist reflecting on Nelson Mandela's death, and specifically the telling of Mandela's life, had this to say. It was an amazing piece. Wish I could remember her name, but she wrote so beautifully. She said, people making Mandela into a saint erases the very humanity through which he offered a model that we could follow. I need to know the warts, which is why the Torah is so holy. Our characters are far from perfect. So what a gift it is to figure out what part of the past am I going to channel into the future, which I need the power, the self-empowerment, which Rana's work and many others help us achieve by self-reflection, by honesty, by self-confrontation, and then hopefully even an experience of liberation, not from my past, but to be part of my own story. I'll never actually be the author of my context, but where I am in it matters quite a lot. There's a great expression of this in another tshuva, I think it's in this book. David Fine is the rabbi who edited the book. He also wrote a legal response on the question of egalitarianism, in which he said, when it comes to the flow of the river of halakha, of Jewish law, we don't originate where it came from, but we can influence the direction into which the stream will flow. So egalitarianism is not where Jewish law came from, but we can influence it to move forward as arbiters of our own story, because we are the water too. It's a very powerful, powerful question. And Maimonides offers an answer that is as perplexing as the question. But again, he thinks that's noble.
So I both agree and disagree. I think...
How Jewish.
How Jewish. I disagree particularly with the responsa about videotaping, because I think that what this book shows us, and what you just said, is that there's a great danger in mythologizing our past and where people have come from. And the ending really tells that. I mean, I think that what I like about services and our services and what I like about live theater is that you see people and the very power of them, that our services are not performances. They're actual events in time, and people make mistakes, and that's okay. I just think and maybe it's because I grew up in a perfectionist household, but I think that there's this idea that we're trying to make the world a better place, but we are not perfect people who are doing it. And I think that the ending where Mandela is mythologized as this great person, or Judith is mythologized as this person who made this great sacrifice, prevents, it holds up this ideal that we can't live up to. And that can lead to despair. Whereas the idea that those events, those family fights at the holidays, are because they're so emotionally fraught, and we are there and we are present. And it's from those events and from building meaning out of them, from our imperfections. I think that that's what brings hope to the world.
Amen. Amen. I all agree with what you said. I entirely agree. It's also what I enjoy about our experience davening as a community. And live theater is a great example. We shy away from the notion of theater, but sacred theater is an honest conversation. It's an honest moment. And the imperfection is what not only gives the world hope, but also gives me my own sense of competency. I can do something because I don't need to be perfect. It's a great moment from Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time series, where Meg, who's one of the central characters, the central character, is confronted by the actual principal of her school and 2 other copies, 2 other alien imposters, as it were. And they need to prove which one is her, and that's a big test in her experience. When one of them presents, they all sound the same, they all look the same, they know the same history. When one of them presents, they stumble in their words, and she knows that's the real one. And that's how she finds her way forward. And Manuel Engel is a deeply religious author. Catholicism and beautiful senses of redemption pervade her books. And I had the occasion to ask her actually in a church on Amsterdam Avenue in New York 20 years ago, what about Meg and Charles Wallace, who's Meg's brother, was so important to her that she needed to develop these characters so much. She said, because that's who we could be. Charles Wallace has an intuition that just goes beyond normal human ability, and Meg is really human and not beyond human ability. And together, they give us a map forward. So what I'd like to suggest is that we, first of all, thank David Gill and the Adult Education Committee for bringing us together. And thank you to Doug Lubis and to Itai. It is really great for us to be together learning. Thank you to Dara Horn for writing such an amazing invitation, which is what this book, I think, really is. And I look forward to learning more as time goes on. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.